Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here this week. We are here to talk about a really interesting story from our history, and that was the first Thanksgiving. And it happened when a group of individuals in England who were pilgrims and who were trying to establish and exercise their right to religion, their right to their version of Christianity, which was very Puritan and very strict in nature. And they felt very put upon by the government in England, especially the king and the kingdom, who were trying to impose upon everyone the Church of England. And so these pilgrims eventually struck off to Netherlands first. For 6 months, they tried Netherlands as a place that could potentially house their little community. Did not work out very well there for the first 6 months. They were unable to grow crops and they did not know the language. Ended up returning to England, and then they set up this committee to start putting together a voyage to the New World. Initially, they had two ships. One of them was the Mayflower. The other one was a ship that they were unable to get into shape to sail. So 102 of them packed onto the Mayflower, which was actually not in very good shape either, but they were able to make it work. They packed all the supplies they could get at the time. There were actually some investors who invested in this particular enterprise, thinking they could get some profit out of it because the New World was going to be so plentiful and bountiful. They packed onto the ship and they sailed, and it took them 66 total days to get to the New World. They thought they were heading towards Virginia, which is where, of course, the Jamestown settlement had also settled. That's where they wanted to go, but they got blown off course, and got blown off course so substantially they ended up landing in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which is where they ended up setting up their settlement. They ended up spending the first winter on their ship. Half of them died from disease and starvation before the harsh winter was over, but by the time it was over, they were able to disembark off of the ship and get to land and start setting up their settlement. They had brought a number of supplies, both food, but also wood and other things to set up some rudimentary shelters. Initially, they were visited by Indians who actually spoke English, and they immediately started to negotiate with the local Indians and were able to set up a peace treaty with them and actually start working together and partnering together. On the ship that winter, when so many of them were suffering, they set up what was called the Mayflower Compact, which was a document that all the men on board signed, 41 of them total. And it was the first document in American history where it set up a true governing body, a way that they were going to govern themselves in this new world, in their new community. And so really it's very historic. In 1620, 1621, they set up this document. It actually was able to stay in place for the Plymouth colony for 71 years. And so it really was the way that they kind of governed themselves and were able to move forward as a people in this little town. So we'll get into all those details tonight. And then we'll talk about the first Thanksgiving, which of course was a huge momentous event for them. They shared that first Thanksgiving with the local Indians who they had partnered and signed a peace treaty with. And so it was a big deal that they were able to have a plentiful and bountiful harvest, their first spring and fall there at Plymouth, Massachusetts. So we'll get into all those details now. In September 1620, a small ship called the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers, 50 men, 19 women, and 33 young adults and children. Just 41 of those 102 were true pilgrims, religious separatists seeking freedom from the Church of England. The others were considered common folk and included merchants, craftsmen, indentured servants, and orphan children. The pilgrims called them strangers, but they took them along anyway. Seeking the right to worship as they wished, the pilgrims had signed a contract with the Virginia Company to settle land near the Hudson River, which was then part of northern Virginia. The Virginia Company was a trading company chartered by King James I, with the goal of colonizing parts of the eastern coast of the New World. London stockholders financed the Pilgrims' voyage with the understanding that they'd be repaid in profits from the new settlement. So you can see these trading companies had been set up after Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci and all of the great settlement explorers of the late 1400s and early 1500s. If you haven't had a chance to look at our episode we did on Christopher Columbus and the great explorers, please check that out. You'll learn a lot about what happened in that late 1400s, early 1500s with the first individuals who came here to actually explore the New World, thinking they were heading towards India and the East Asia area, but ended up coming upon this new continent that no one knew about. So storms threw them off course. Instead of reaching the Virginia colony, they landed in Provincetown Harbor in November 1620, after a treacherous and uncomfortable crossing that lasted 66 days. When the Mayflower landed in Massachusetts instead of Virginia, discord began before the colonists even left the ship. The strangers argued the Virginia Company contract was void. They felt since the Mayflower had landed outside of Virginia Company territory, they were no longer bound to the company's charter. The defiant strangers refused to recognize any rules since there were no official government over them. Pilgrim leader William Bradford later wrote, "Several strangers made discontented and mutinous speeches." Pilgrim leaders wanted to quell the rebellion before it took hold. After all, establishing a new world colony would be difficult enough without dissent in the ranks. The Pilgrims knew they needed as many productive, law-abiding souls as possible to make the colony successful. With that in mind, they set out to create a temporary set of laws for ruling themselves as per majority agreement. While on board the Mayflower in Provincetown Harbor, the Pilgrims drew up the Mayflower Compact, and all the men on board the ship, which was 41 adult male colonists, including 2 indentured servants, signed the Mayflower Pact on November 11, 1620, although it was not called that at the time. This document created a way for Pilgrims to govern themselves. The Mayflower Compact was important because it was the first document to establish self-government in the New World. It remained active until 1691, when the Plymouth colony became part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So pretty incredible that that Mayflower Compact that they all signed was in effect for 71 years of the Plymouth colony. After exploring the area, the Pilgrims decided to settle there in Plymouth and build a town. Throughout the first brutal winter, most of the colonists remained aboard the ship, where they suffered from exposure, scurvy, and outbreaks of contagious diseases. Only half of the Mayflower's original passengers and crew lived to see their first New England spring. So if you just think about how incredibly impactful that must have been, that half of them died in the first winter on the ship. In March, the remaining settlers moved ashore, where they received an astonishing visit from an Abenaki Indian who greeted them in English. Several days later, he returned with other Native American named Squanto, the member of the Pawtuxet tribe who had been kidnapped by an English sea captain and sold into slavery before escaping to London and returning to his homeland in an exploratory expedition. So what an incredible story about Squanto, who was captured, sold into slavery, escaped in England, and found his way onto an exploratory mission ship to return back to his home. Squanto taught the Pilgrims, who were weakened by malnutrition and illness, how to cultivate corn, extract sap from the maple trees, catch fish in the rivers, and avoid poisonous plants. He also helped the settlers forge an alliance with the Wampanoag, which was a local tribe living in Cape Cod, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, and inland. Massawat was the chief of the Wampanoag. In early spring of 1621, the Pilgrims met with Massawat and agreed to live peaceably with the Wampanoags and help each other, essentially to form a partnership. This relationship would endure for more than 50 years and tragically remains one of the sole examples of harmony between European colonists and Native Americans. So really all the misinformation you hear from some people about the first Thanksgiving and this colony being very abusive towards the Indians, it really wasn't true. There were a couple of skirmishes they had with some Indian tribes, but not with the Wampanoag. The Wampanoag and they were very tight, and as a matter of fact, they really needed each other to survive and helped each other to cultivate crops and to catch food and to trade together and to really grow and to prosper. So the truth is that the first Thanksgiving really did represent cooperation between these two. In the spring, with help from the Indians, the Pilgrims planted corn maize and peas and barley. They also hunted fowl and deer. They searched for wild berries and for fruits, and they fished. In the late fall, after the corn harvest, the Pilgrims gave thanks by celebrating the first Thanksgiving feast with those Indians. In November 1621, after the Pilgrims' first corn harvest proved successful, Governor William Bradford organized a celebratory feast, which was our first Thanksgiving, and invited a group of fledgling colony Native American allies, including the Wampanoag chief Massasoit, now remembered as America's first Thanksgiving, although the Pilgrims themselves may not have used that term at the time. The festival lasted for a full 3 days. While no record exists of the historic banquet's exact menu, the Pilgrim Chronicle's Edward Winslow wrote in his journal, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men for fowls, so we might have special manner and rejoice together. After we had gathered the fruits of our labors, the 4 one day killed such fowl as with little help besides served the company almost a week, at which time almost all other recreations were exercised in our arms. Many of the Indians coming brought us and helped us get the greatest King Massasoit and his 70 men, for which 3 days we entertained and feasted them, and we went out and killed live deer and brought them to the plantation and bestowed them on our governor and our settlers. And although it may not always be so plentiful as it was this time, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers of our plenty." So you can see they really were celebrating Thanksgiving. They were so thankful that they actually had food to eat. They had a partnership with the Wampanoag. They were settling, they were building their buildings, and they were really feeling like they'd been through the harsh winter and the hard journey, but they were finally starting to turn the corner. When they ate, the Pilgrims did not use forks. They used a knife, a spoon, a large napkin, and their fingers. They also shared plates and drinking vessels. The Pilgrims did not eat cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie like we do at their first Thanksgiving. They ate roasted wild fowl, such as duck, goose, and turkey. They ate cornmeal, cod, which is one of the more popular fish in New England, sea bass, and venison or deer that had been brought to them by the Indians. Historians have suggested that many of the dishes were likely prepared using traditional Native American spices and cooking methods. It's really interesting that the Native Americans, not only did they teach them to fish and to hunt deer and to grow crops that actually worked there in New England, but they also taught them how to cook and taught them how to use spices. Because of the Pilgrims had no oven at the time, and the Mayflower sugar supply had dwindled by the fall of 1621, the meal did not feature pies, cakes, or other desserts, which had become a huge hallmark of our contemporary traditions. Pilgrims held their second Thanksgiving celebration in 1623 to mark the end of a long drought that had threatened the year's harvest and prompted Governor Bradford to call for a religious feast. Days of fasting and Thanksgiving on an annual or occasional basis became common practice in other New England settlements as well. During the American Revolution, the Continental Congress designated 1 or more days of Thanksgiving a year. And in 1789, George Washington issued the first Thanksgiving proclamation by the national government of the United States. In it, he called upon Americans to express their gratitude for a happy conclusion to the country's War of Independence and the successful ratification of the U.S. Constitution. His successors, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, also designated days of thanks during their presidencies. In 1817, New York became the first of several states to officially adopt an annual Thanksgiving Day holiday. Each celebrated it on a different day, however, and the American South remained largely unfamiliar with the tradition. So you can see the initial Thanksgivings that happened in the 1600s and then eventually in the early 1800s really occurred mainly in New England and New York and Pennsylvania and all the northern states. The southern states had not yet picked up the tradition. In 1827, the noted magazine editor and prolific writer Sarah Josepha Hale, and she was author, among countless other things, of the nursery rhyme Mary Had a Little Lamb, which is very famous. She launched a campaign to establish Thanksgiving as a national holiday. For 36 years, she published numerous editorials and sent scores of letters to governors, senators, presidents, and other politicians. Abraham Lincoln finally heeded her request in 1863, so 36 years later, at the height of the Civil War, in a proclamation entreating all Americans to ask God to command to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife, and to heal the wounds of the nation. He scheduled Thanksgiving for the final Thursday in November, and it was celebrated on that day every year until 1939, when Franklin D. Roosevelt moved the holiday up a week in an attempt to spur retail sales during the Great Depression. Roosevelt's plan, known derisively as Franksgiving, was met with passionate opposition, and in 1941, just 2 years later, the president reluctantly signed a bill making Thanksgiving the fourth Thursday in November. So you can see he tried an experiment there to move it up a week so that there'd be more sales for Christmas, but did not work, and the country rejected that. And now we've settled on the fourth Thursday in November as our Thanksgiving Day. So really interesting history there, as you can see, behind Thanksgiving, behind the first settlers in Plymouth, Massachusetts, to celebrate it with their local Indian friends. And the Mayflower, of course, being their vessel to come over the very long journey. And of course, they lost half of their colony on that first very harsh winter before they could settle themselves. So let's go ahead and take a look at a short video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
We all know the famous story of Thanksgiving, the picture-perfect meal shared by Native Americans and Pilgrims as a symbol of gratitude, cooperation, and peace. The true story behind the feast is much more complex. Among other things, the first Thanksgiving was a temporary celebration in the midst of struggle and cultural misunderstandings. Keep watching to learn more about the Pilgrims, the Native Americans, and the captivating true story of the first Thanksgiving. Who attended the first Thanksgiving? To fully understand the significance of the first Thanksgiving, we must also understand the people who attended it: the Pilgrims, who were struggling to survive in a new world, and the Wampanoag people, who had lived on the land for centuries and were grappling with a changing world as more and more European settlers arrived. We'll begin with the Pilgrims. The early 1600s were a time of exploration, hardship, and survival for the Pilgrims, a group of settlers who had left England to start anew after growing tired of religious persecution in their homeland. After a grueling journey across the Atlantic on the Mayflower, they landed near what we know today as Plymouth, Massachusetts. The journey was brutal. The Mayflower set sail in September 1620 with over 100 passengers crammed into a single deck below the main deck. During the 2-month journey, they faced cramped quarters, poor sanitation, and constant seasickness. To make matters worse, they arrived in America as winter was beginning. Many were already weak from the journey, and the cold made survival even more of a challenge. The Pilgrims' first winter in New England was much harsher than expected. Without enough food and shelter to prepare for the winter, they endured freezing temperatures, illnesses, and malnutrition. By spring, nearly half of the settlers had perished from exposure, unprotection from severe weather, or disease. Every day was a struggle for the newly arrived Pilgrims as their survival hung in the balance. The Pilgrims were not alone. They settled in the territory of the Wampanoag tribe. Despite the Pilgrims' need for help, early interactions between the Pilgrims and the indigenous people were marred by mistrust. The two groups had vastly different cultures, languages, and beliefs. Both sides knew that a misstep might lead to conflict, which neither people could afford. The Wampanoag people had lived in the area for centuries, cultivating the land, fishing, hunting, and gathering. Their leader, Massasoit, was well aware of the encroachment of European settlers and the danger it posed to his people. Along with the threat they posed, Massasoit also recognized the opportunity the newcomers represented. The Wampanoag people had suffered from devastating diseases brought by earlier European explorers, and their population was severely reduced. He believed an alliance with the Pilgrims could help strengthen their defenses against rival tribes. This is where a man named Squanto came in. Squanto was a Patuxet tribesman with a unique perspective on the new European arrivals. Years before, Squanto was captured by English traders and sold into slavery in Spain. He managed to escape to England, where he learned English, before eventually returning to his homeland. Tragically, he found his entire Patuxet tribe wiped out by disease when he returned. Squanto became an interpreter and a mediator, bridging the gap between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. His knowledge of English and first-hand experience with both cultures made him an invaluable ally to both sides. He taught the Pilgrims essential survival skills, such as planting corn, using fish as fertilizer, catching fish and eel, and safely foraging for edible and medicinal plants. This shared knowledge transformed the Pilgrims' chances for survival, allowing them to finally cultivate their own food. As the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people strengthened, Massasoit and the Pilgrim leaders agreed on a mutual protection treaty. This pact was intended to safeguard both parties from potential threats and establish peace and cooperation. The alliance was delicate, built on a mixture of trust, caution, and mutual need. The first Thanksgiving feast. By the autumn of 1621, the Pilgrims had managed their first successful harvest with the help of Squanto and the Wampanoag people. This was a monumental achievement for them, drastically increasing their hope for survival after nearly a year of unimaginable hardship and loss. The Pilgrims wanted to celebrate this harvest and express their gratitude for the help they'd received from their Native American allies. So they invited Massasoit, the Wampanoag leader, and his men to join them in a shared meal. This gathering would be what we now know as the First Thanksgiving, and it was meant to strengthen the blooming hope and friendship between the two groups of people. The exact date of the feast is unknown, but most historians place it in late September or early October. Unlike how we typically imagine it, this was not a single meal, but a festival, likely lasting about 3 days. It was a time for feasting, entertainment, and diplomacy. But it wasn't just a celebration. It was an opportunity for both groups to honor their alliance, share their respective traditions, and show mutual respect to each other. They came from wildly different backgrounds, but the first Thanksgiving offered them a chance to connect. Who was there and what did they eat? By the time the first Thanksgiving took place, about 50 Pilgrims were left, a small fraction of the number who had arrived on the Mayflower. On the other hand, Massasoit arrived with around 90 Wampanoag men, a much larger group than the Pilgrims had anticipated. Seeing their native neighbors in such large numbers might have intimidated the Pilgrims, but they welcomed them anyway. Based on those numbers, the gathering would have been approximately 140 people, making it the largest social event the Pilgrims had experienced since their arrival. The food at this feast would have been very different from what Americans now associate with Thanksgiving. While today's Thanksgiving meals typically include turkey, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie, the fare in 1621 consisted only of what the Pilgrims and Wampanoag could hunt, gather, and grow with their own hands. The feast most likely consisted of a wide variety of native food. The Wampanoag brought 5 deer. For the Wampanoag, bringing food to a communal feast was customary, and venison was an essential part of their diet. Since they lived so close to the coast, the Pilgrims had easy access to shellfish and other seafood. Mussels, lobster, clams, and even eel may have been part of the feast. Both groups may have provided fowl like ducks, geese, or wild turkeys. Wild turkeys were native to the region and plentiful, but no historical record confirms that this classic Thanksgiving dish was on the menu. Both peoples might have also harvested vegetables like corn, squash, and beans, as well as nuts and berries that were native to the forests of New England. Chestnuts, walnuts, and beechnuts were likely on the table for that first feast. Although cranberries would have been available, cranberry sauce probably wasn't part of the feast because the Pilgrims didn't have the luxury of sugar. What did the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people do at the feast? While we often envision a large meal when we think of the first Thanksgiving, the feast was not just about eating. Historical accounts suggest that the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag put on various forms of entertainment throughout the event. The Pilgrims used the occasion to show off their military skills through firing drills and musket handling. This was likely a show of strength, demonstrating to the Wampanoag that they could defend themselves if needed. For the Wampanoag, gatherings like this typically involve storytelling, games, and athletic contests. It's possible that the Wampanoag entertained the Pilgrims with foot races, wrestling matches, or other forms of physical competition. These activities fostered camaraderie and mutual respect, allowing the two groups to see each other as people rather than just convenient allies. The dark side of the first Thanksgiving. While there was much to be thankful for, and the feast was a time of celebration, it also highlighted the cultural gap between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. For the Pilgrims, this feast was an expression of gratitude to their God for providing a successful harvest, and to the Wampanoag for their support. For the Wampanoag, sharing food was an important part of their culture, a way of honoring relationships. For Massasoit, participating in the feast was a strategic move and a gesture of goodwill. His people had endured massive suffering from diseases introduced by earlier European explorers, and their population had dwindled. Massasoit's role in the Pilgrims' success was primarily motivated by his desire to secure his people's future in a rapidly changing world. Although the feast is often remembered as a moment of harmony, viewing it within its broader historical context provides valuable insight. The first Thanksgiving was a rare moment of unity that would not last, and it was soon to be overshadowed by the colonization and conflicts that followed. For those few days, though, the groups found common ground. They shared food, companionship, and maybe a sense of relief knowing that they were stronger together, if only temporarily. While the first Thanksgiving isn't the purely joyful occasion we often think of, it was a symbol of hope and a rare moment of peace in an otherwise conflict-riddled history. The aftermath and legacy of the first Thanksgiving. The peace between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag did not last forever. As more European settlers arrived, tensions grew. The original alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people began to break down under immense pressure from things like land disputes and competition for resources. The settlers' relationship with the indigenous people shifted as the colony expanded. The Pilgrims' descendants and later settlers saw the land as theirs to cultivate and populate, often disrespecting the Wampanoag people and other tribes. This led to a series of conflicts, culminating in King Philip's War, a devastating conflict between the Native American tribes and the New England colonists that lasted from 1675 to 1678. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history, claiming thousands of lives on both sides and leaving a permanent scar on the relationship between the indigenous people and the European settlers. Despite the complex and sometimes dark history surrounding Thanksgiving, it is still celebrated as a national holiday in the United States. The holiday we observe now is as much a product of 19th century myth-making as it is of historical fact. In the 1800s, figures like Sarah Josepha Hale promoted Thanksgiving as a unifying event, idealizing it as a time for Americans to come together. President Abraham Lincoln later established it as an official holiday during the Civil War, re-emphasizing the theme of gratitude and national unity. In contrast to the story painted in the years since the first Thanksgiving feast, the real story of Thanksgiving is a brief moment of unity between two vastly different societies.
So you can see from that video that there was a lot of things going on. The fact that these settlers survived their first winter really was a miracle. The fact that they survived this incredible crossing for 66 days on what was really a ship that had a lot of problems with it was also a blessing for them and really a miracle. The final miracle was that they were able to get along with the Indians when they got there, and they were actually able to form a partnership with them and work together for over 70 years until, as you saw in the video, that conflict broke out. And it broke out between the Indians and the settlers because settlers kept coming and kept coming and kept coming from Europe and kept taking land and kept taking resources. And at some point, the Indians got fed up with that. And you can understand why. So essentially, the peaceful time that we celebrate, that is the first Thanksgiving on, lasted for a while, lasted for a good almost 70 years. And then at some point it broke down and the conflict started, and really as has happened in most of human history, conflicts usually happen over land or over resources. And that's what happened here. But in the end, really fascinating history, as you can see, in terms of the Pilgrims, their journey over, their settlement in Plymouth, their partnership with the local Indians, their establishment of Thanksgiving and harvests, and their ability to actually survive in the New World in a very different place, a very different culture, different climate. They learned lots of new skills. The fact that they were able to come upon a tribe that was willing to work with them, and to come upon Squanto, who knew English and knew a lot of skills on how to live off the land, and was able to work with them and willing to work with them to help them get established and get this colony underway. All of those things really, in a lot of ways, were a miracle and have a lot of reasons that we give thanks today as to how this settlement was able to be successful. So that's a little bit about that video. As you see, some of the foods they were eating at the time were very different from what we eat today. Their celebration was a little bit different, although it really was everyone gathered around tables and eating and celebrating and laughing. There were games going on. The Indians introduced them to different sports they had never seen before. And there was a lot of wine drunk as you can imagine, and beer, and a lot of good times. And that's one reason why the settlers and the Wampanoag were able to work so well together, was they got off to a really good start, and that really is to be celebrated. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the Mayflower Compact, which is a really interesting document for this group. So the Mayflower Compact, originally titled The Agreement Between Settlers of New Plymouth, was the first governing document of the Plymouth colony. It was written by men aboard the Mayflower, consisting of separatist Puritans, adventurers, and tradesmen. Although the agreement contained a pledge of loyalty to the king, the Puritans and other Protestant separatists were dissatisfied with the state of the Church of England, the limited extent of the English Reformation, and reluctance of King James I of England to enforce further reform. The Mayflower Compact was signed aboard the ship on November 21st, 1620. Signing the covenant were the 41 of the ship's 101 passengers, all men at the time. The Mayflower was anchored in Provincetown Harbor within the Hook at the northern tip of Cape Cod. The Pilgrims had originally hoped to reach America in early October using 2 ships, but delays and complications meant they could only use one, which was the Mayflower. Their intended destination had always been the colony of Virginia, with the journey financed by the Company of Merchant Adventurers of London. Storms forced them to anchor at the Hook of Cape Cod in Massachusetts, however, as it was unwise to continue with provisions running short. This inspired some of the non-Puritan passengers to proclaim that they would use their own liberty, for none had power to command them, since they would not be settling in the agreed-upon Virginia territory. To prevent this, the Pilgrims determined to establish their own government, while still affirming their allegiance to the Crown of England. Thus, the Mayflower Compact was based simultaneously upon majoritarian model and the settlers' allegiance to the king. It was, in essence, a social contract in which the settlers consented to follow the community's rules and regulations for the sake of order and survival. Similar arguments had been unsuccessfully made by the shipwrecked passengers of the Sea Venture, a similar earlier group bound for the colony of Virginia, and specifically by one Stephen Hopkins, who had as a result been convicted of mutiny and sentenced to death, but pardoned, and is thought to be Stephen Hopkins aboard the Mayflower and among the compact signatories. So pretty interesting that this Stephen Hopkins was on both ships, and might have been one of the reasons why there had been talk of mutiny. The Pilgrims had lived for some months in Leiden, the city in the Dutch Republic, as we talked about earlier. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick states, just as a spiritual covenant had marked the beginning of the congregation in Leiden, a civil covenant would provide the basis for a secular government in America. In terms of the text of the document, the original text has been lost, but 3 versions exist from the 17th century printed Mort's Revelation, which was reprinted in Purchas de Pilgrim, which was a handwritten by William Bradford in his journal of Plymouth Plantation, and printed by Bradford's nephew Nathaniel Morton in New England's Memorial in 1669. 3 versions differ slightly in wording and significantly in spelling. William Bradford wrote the first part of Mort's Revelation, including his version of the compact, so he wrote 2 of the 3 versions. The wording in these 2 versions is quite similar, unlike that of Morton. Bradford's handwriting manuscript is kept in the vault at the State Library of Massachusetts. And here's how the text goes in this compact. In the name of God, Amen. We, those names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of faith, having undertaken for the glory of God the advancement of the Christian faith, the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into one civil body, politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of ends aforesaid, and the virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame just such equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, from time to time as shall be thought most convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness thereof, we have hereunto subscribed our names at Cape Cod the 11th of November in the reign of our sovereign King Lord James of England, France, and Ireland, and of the Scotland and 54th Anno Domini in 1620. The document was signed on November 21st in 1620. In terms of the signers, we talked about the list of male passengers who signed the document was supplied by Bradford's nephew, Nathaniel Morton, in his 1669 New England Memorial. Thomas Prince first numbered the names of 1736, a chronological history of the New England in form of annals. The original document, although it's lost, Morton's list of names was unnumbered and untitled in all 6 editions, although their order changed with successive editions. In his original 1669 edition, the names were placed on 2 successive pages, forming 6 short columns, 3 per page. In subsequent editions, these 6 short columns were combined into 3 long columns on a single page. The second and third editions changed the order of the first edition by combining the first and fourth columns into first long column and similarly to other columns. In terms of the first 10 signers of the Mayflower Compact, the first one was John Carver. Second one, of course, was Governor William Bradford. Then there was Edward Winslow, William Brewster, Isaac Alberton, Miles Standish, John Aden, Samuel Fuller, Christopher Martin, and William Mullins. On November 23, 1920, at a commemoration ceremony for the 300th anniversary of the Mayflower landing, then Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge, who became the 30th president a few years later, said following about the Mayflower Compact. The compact, which they signed, was an event of the greatest importance. It was the foundation of liberty based on law, order, and the tradition that is steadily upheld. They drew up a form of government which has been designated as the first real constitution of modern times. It was democratic, an acknowledgement of liberty under law and order, and the giving to each person the right to participate in the government while they promised to be obedient to its laws. But the really wonderful thing is that they had the power and strength of character to abide by it and live by it from that day to this. Some governments are better than others, but any form of government is better than anarchy. And any attempt to tear down government is an attempt to wreck civilization. It's really interesting that Calvin Coolidge felt necessity to actually give a speech and remarks on the Mayflower Compact, and that he really felt that it was the foundation of our government, even today, foundation of our Constitution and of our overall government. It was the first time that a government had truly been by the people, for the people in this little Plymouth settlement. It's really interesting there. In terms of our Thanksgiving Day holiday, today in 2024, it falls on Thursday, November 28th, which is this week. I hope all of you have a wonderful time at that celebration. Of course, in 1621, the Plymouth colonists from England and Native American Wampanoag people shared an autumn festival feast that is acknowledged to be the first Thanksgiving celebrations in the colonies. For more than 2 centuries, days of Thanksgiving were celebrated by individual colonies and states. And as you heard, it was 1863 when Abraham Lincoln proclaimed it as a national holiday. What was interesting, though, is that over the years, there have been some other states and colonies that have argued that the Plymouth Thanksgiving was actually not the first. So that it's still not fully settled that it's the first, although we always consider it to be. I know there were other colonies in Virginia and other places that claimed that they had celebrations even before 1621 that were part of our lexicon. In terms of other things that happened today, of course, Thanksgiving Day food has become very settled. Turkey being the center of our Thanksgiving Day bountiful meal, ham and other incredible sides, vegetables and others. Also, other celebrations, we have, of course, football on Thanksgiving Day now. We have parades like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade and other parades that are going on. All have become huge traditions in our modern day. The Thanksgiving Day Parade, as an example, has as many as 3 million spectators along its 2.5-mile route in New York City. And then there's parades in lots of other cities as well. There's also another tradition that's been really fun in the 20th and 21st centuries, and that is the tradition where the President of the United States pardons 1 or 2 Thanksgiving turkeys each year, sparing the birds from slaughter and sending them to a farm for retirement. A number of U.S. governors also perform the annual turkey pardoning ritual. And that's always been a lot of fun to watch that happen at the White House and other locations. as the president pardons one or two of those turkeys and usually gives them a really funny name. So really interesting, as you can see, our history behind Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving, whether it took place in Plymouth or not, and the incredibly harsh situation that the first settlers in Plymouth found themselves in, the first democratic government that they established as part of that Mayflower Compact, the incredible fact that they actually even survived those first couple of years by leaning on the local tribes as a partnership. And then all the way up to today, the incredible history of Abraham Lincoln making it a national holiday, FDR solidifying that by making it a national holiday by law and giving all federal employees, and of course now many companies also abide by that, a national holiday. And then that leads all the way up to today and how we celebrate Thanksgiving as a day of thanks nationally. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about Thanksgiving. You learned a lot about the settlers in Plymouth, about our incredible beginnings in this country and all the people that came over at great risk to themselves, about the Mayflower Compact, which was our first democratic document in our history in 1620. And that I hope you all want to dig a little bit more into the history of Thanksgiving. And you really think about, as you sit around the table this year with your family, everything it means to us as a country and to you. And you really consider all the things you have to be thankful for. So have a fantastic time together Thanksgiving. Thank you for joining today. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great content coming your way and a lot of great topics. And drop us a comment if there's a topic that you really want us to cover on Traveling Through History. We'd love to do so. Drop us a comment and we will take a look at it and put it into the rotation. Everyone have a great evening and a great Thanksgiving. Thanks so much.